So I don't tend to cry a lot at movies, but I can remember a few. And I think I'm strong enough to admit that a lot of them, if not most of them, were animated movies. Like the first one I think I can remember ever crying at was when Bambi's mom got shot. You remember that? I was watching that with my own mom, though. I want to cry every time I watch the movie Up. You've seen this. There's this sequence at the beginning of the movie where the little couple meet each other. They grow up together, right? They eventually get married. They buy a house. They fix it up. They want to have kids, but then they can't have kids. And then there's this scene where Ellie is just sitting in a chair on a hill somewhere looking at the sun. She's sad but content. And then it's like the very next scene, little old man Carl is all by himself. And that's pretty deep for a kid's movie, right? I think if you don't at least get a little quiver in your lip watching that, I mean, you might need to talk to a counselor or something, right? It's deep. I remember another movie that I got emotional the first time I saw it was Wreck-It Ralph. Because you remember Princess Penelope? She didn't know she was a princess, and neither did I for a long time. And I remember watching this movie. She was a character that couldn't race in a racing game because she had a glitch. The other characters were just cruel. They called her Glitch Girl. And I remember watching it with my kids. The movie kind of took some turns. And at one point, they look over at me like, "Dad, are you crying?" And I'm like, "Zip it and just watch the movie." Because I think it just kind of reminded me of all the times maybe I've let my glitches or other people make me feel like I wasn't good enough. I didn't have what it takes. And nowadays, like our technology, this digital world we live in, I mean, this can have us really comparing ourselves a lot. It can have us seeking validation, wrecking our confidence. It's almost like this magic 8-ball. I pull it out of my pocket and check Facebook today to think, okay, well, what are the popular views I need to agree with today? Hey, TikTok, is my dance move on point today, right? In fact, we can try some AI right now. Hey, Siri, do I have what it takes?
I can't help you with that.
No help. But because there's so much information out there to compare myself to, it can start to feel really overwhelming. And so we are in week 3 of this series called AI Authentic Intelligence, where we're learning to try to think smart in our digital world. And so Andy kicked us off in week 1 by talking about the conflict that we experience with this and reminding us that really at the core, what we're dealing with is not that new. And he reminded us that, when I think differently, I will live differently. And so obviously our digital world has a lot to do with how we think. Then last week, Morgan did a great job of talking about the consumption and how that affects us with all of this as well. And so he encouraged us to maybe take some time to examine our habits and maybe to explore the science, take some intentional time to even take a break if we need to. And so I've been trying to lean into that myself a little bit more this week. And so today our assignment is to think about our confidence and how all of this digital media and this world we live in can really kind of play with our insecurities. And we're going to talk about a few of those today as well. Because I think every person in this room here at Lake Oconee, every person in the room at Houston Church, at some point we're all going to ask ourselves one of the most personal questions, one of the most inescapable questions of life. It's a question that comes up in a lot of different ways in our digital world. It's a question, I think, that gets right to the heart of our sense of purpose and our sense of confidence. Do I have what it takes? Do I have what it takes? And if we struggle at all with insecurity or confidence on any level, and I think we all do, I've kind of seen that we fall into at least one of three categories of people, especially through these digital personas that we try to put out there. So maybe you can hear yourself or maybe know somebody in one of these. The first group I would call the clingers. Clingers are really insecure about themselves. They don't really trust themselves at all. So they need to seek validation from everybody else. Clingers can be people pleasers, which on the surface can be really cool because people pleasers will give a lot of compliments, right? They'll do you a lot of favors. They give lots of likes and hearts online. They can make you feel really good about yourself because they're trying to please. But at the heart of all of that, there's this need for them to constantly worry about what other people think about them. Hey, are we good? Are we good? Did I do something to upset you? Oh, I did. I'm sorry. What do I need to say? What do we need to do? Are we good now? Are we good? Because if I think you don't like me for some reason, well, that just seems to prove some of my worst fears about myself. So another group I think we all kind of tend to lean towards at some parts of our life because we all want to feel like we're valuable. We want to know we're not just taking up space on this planet. But it can become toxic as well. And when it gets to that, I think we become what I call fishers. And fishers have a hard time really trusting themselves or anybody else. And so there's this fear that can keep them from taking any steps, from making any moves, embracing any kind of opportunity until they have certainty. I got to know for certain before I do anything, before I commit to anything. They can even sometimes self-sabotage something if they think it's not going to go well. They'll blow it up before it blows itself up, or maybe use self-deprecating humor because I want to get it out and say it before you say what I'm afraid you might be thinking about me. You know, fishers can be, in general, pretty anxious people, constantly fishing for validation before making any moves. They might take 20 selfies of themselves, pick the one that they like the best, put it out there with a hey, I look so ugly today. Just hoping somebody will be like, no, you look beautiful. I wish I looked like you every day. You know, after a presentation, I just blew that. Man, that was bunk. No, dude, that was awesome. That was great. Like if I'm not careful, the first thing I'll ask, like a lot of speakers do, when I get done today, I'll walk off and, hey, how did I do? Right? Because we want to know. We want to know if we're okay with all of that. Anybody here, does this sound familiar to anybody? Anxious. They can be avoidant. Yeah, some of you probably should be raising your hand. But you're looking around because you need confirmation from who else is raising their hand first. You're avoidant. A third group is probably the hardest one, I think, maybe to recognize because I call them the fakers. Fakers can portray a sense of artificial confidence that can be really hard to see even in themselves. And they really only trust themselves. They're the ones that kind of live by, hey, if you want it done right, you got to do it yourself. There you are. There's the control freaks, right? There you are. But it could be also just a deep hurt from the past that keeps them very protective about who they're going to trust, who they're going to ask to help them with anything. And so they can come across very proud, maybe even arrogant, but not confident. Why? Because all of this pride is driven by an image that they feel like they have to maintain or a performance that they have to rise to all the time in order to prove their worth, in order to prove that they're valuable. Always something to prove, not to themselves, but to everybody else. And when you think about it, there is an artificial confidence that comes when we get likes, right? When we get hearts, when we make achievements. But it can be fleeting. Why? Because all of that confidence is based on circumstances. It's circumstantial, and circumstances change. And as they change, then I feel like I've got to constantly keep up. I've got to constantly keep proving myself in order to feel important. And maybe that's something that all three of these have in common, where they kind of overlap. This unhealthy need to prove myself, whether you're the clingy people pleaser, whether you're that anxious, avoidant fisher, whether you're an artificially confident faker. There's an unhealthy drive to perform. There's a toxic need to be needed. There's this image management I got to keep up all the time. And so I have to constantly prove I'm valuable because I'm never really quite sure myself. And I think this is why maybe we love these stories of underdogs, right? In fact, even this last week, I read about a guy at the Wimbledon tournament. I don't watch tennis a lot, but his story is pretty cool. It's a guy, I think his name was Christopher Eubanks. And by the midweek, by like Wednesday, he'd gotten farther than anybody thought he would, including himself, because he actually had to extend his hotel stay in London 3 times just because he kept winning. And I'm like, wow, that's cool. Well, we love those stories, right? The dark horse that showed up and proved them wrong. It's inspiring. It's motivating. I know, like, if I have a hard workout or I'm going out on a difficult run, I may put on some music and the songs are some version of I'm going to show them, right? I'm the greatest. Ain't nobody going to stop me, right? And that's great. It's motivating for like an hour at the gym. It's good to get hyped up before a big game. But when that becomes your life's mantra, it's overwhelming because it's rooted in insecurity, not real confidence. You know what I'm learning is even better than proving them wrong? Not feeling like I have to prove them wrong. True confidence has nothing to prove. Now, you might show up and it might prove some things to people. That's not the motivation. I've already demonstrated. I already have confidence. Real confidence in myself means I like myself. I know what I like about myself, and I trust myself. I mean, wouldn't that feel great? How might that look for you, though? What does it take to kind of get there? Well, I think a lot of times when we don't feel confident about something, we just have this tendency to not show up to that thing, right? If I don't feel I'm up to the task, then I won't even apply for that job. I won't even go out for that promotion. If I don't think I can play that sport, I'm not even going to try out. I won't even give myself the chance, right? If I don't think I can make a really good grade in that class or with that teacher, I'll drop it. I'll find something else to take. I'll avoid it, right? I could never lead a small group. I'm not spiritual enough. If I didn't think a girl would go out with me, how many of you who used the pre-qualifier? Go ahead, you know what the pre-qualifier is? It's when you send like your buddy to do a little reconnaissance. Hey, if Dennis were to ask you out, you think you'd go? That's how I got my wife. Because we all deal with these insecurities in different ways. The tragedy is, though, that so many, maybe even some listening right now, you don't really know yourself because you're constantly living up to all these other expectations that are thrown at you. So you really can't like yourself. And so you're not living out of a sense of purpose like your Heavenly Father wants you to experience because you don't have confidence in the places that you should have confidence. Haven't given yourself the chance yet to feel that, to be confident. Or maybe just your pride has you convinced that you constantly have to prove your worth to everybody else. You have to earn it. And I don't have to list all the ways I think for us that this digital modern world kind of feeds these insecurities. Hopefully you've already thinking a little bit about how this applies in your life. But the root of any of it is not new. In fact, in week 1, we were reminded that as our digital world continues to expand, we kind of just find ourselves encountering new versions of age-old tensions. In fact, the Apostle Paul, and even if you're not a church person, you've maybe heard of St. Paul, probably seen his name on a building somewhere. Paul was a really important major character in first century Christianity, maybe second only to Jesus in his influence. But Paul had a lot of detractors and enemies as well. He was much less respected to a lot of people than some of the other guys like Peter and James and John. And a lot of it had to do with, like when we first read about Paul, he was on a mission to stamp out this new movement of Jesus followers. But then on a trip to go actually do that at a city called Damascus, he has this encounter, this unique encounter with a resurrected Jesus, changes his life. He becomes a Jesus follower as well. But he wasn't one of these 12 that got to hang out. He wasn't one of the original guys that got to do life with Jesus. But he did have an encounter with Jesus, so he calls himself an apostle. But then he was compelled to struggle with comparisons, with criticism, with this pressure to prove his authority and his standing. He even struggled with his own strengths and weaknesses a lot. And he was pretty open about it in his letters. In fact, in the second letter that he wrote to some of the believers that were living in Corinth, he had to defend his own ministry and assert his authority, because at the time there were some of these leaders that were trying to undermine, they were trying to discredit Paul. And the way that he answers their criticism, the way that he answers their comparisons, the way that he answers the question, do I have what it takes? I think it can teach us a lot about what true confidence looks like in our day and age as well. So a little context. At this time, there was a lot going on, and he spent a lot of his letter recounting some of the experiences, some of the persecution that he'd gone through. He talked about his weaknesses, but he also spent a lot of time talking about how he learned to depend on God's strength and grace to get him through all of that. And so he emphasizes to them throughout this letter that the power of humility is a catalyst for confidence. That's where he learned it from. And how through all these challenges that he went through, he learned that real confidence, true confidence, is found in yielding myself to God and relying on his strength, not my own. Because one of the reasons that these Corinthians lacked confidence themselves was their constant tendency to compare themselves to other people. And so he urges them, you need to shift your focus from this outward comparison to an inward examination. Like for us, he might say, hey, you need to quit looking at all the screens to try to figure out who you are and how you measure up. Start by looking into your own hearts. And so as we get to chapter 10 of the second letter he wrote to the Corinthians, he tells them this. He says, by the humility, and this is the humility that's this catalyst for confidence, by the humility and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you. I, Paul, who am timid when face to face with you, but bold towards you when away, exclamation point, because I think he's being a little bit snarky here. Apparently this is how some people have been talking about him. And so he says, I beg you that when I come, I may not have to be as bold as I expect to. Like, don't make me come down there and have to try to flex towards some people who think we live by the standard of this world. Like, I'm humble, but don't make you think that I'm just going to let people accuse me of being some kind of wishy-washy opportunist. And for those of us who maybe know the Apostle Paul, we probably think of him more for his strengths, right? He was the first one to take the gospel, good news of Jesus, beyond just the Jewish people. He was known as a religious giant. He was trained by spiritual gurus. He was awesome at debate and reasoning with people. And he was also a Roman citizen, which gave him access to some things that a lot of people just didn't have. And so we see him showing up at places like Corinth and Athens and Rome. And he was, at this point still, though, having to wrestle with something that we might not think he would have to deal with at this point in his ministry. He's dealing with his own inner bully by having to defend his credentials. And I kind of find the subtle encouragement in the fact that even at this point, with all that he had accomplished, he is still wrestling with this question, do I have what it takes? Because for a lot of us, I think as we got older, we kind of thought that question would go away, didn't we? When I graduated finally, when I finally got married, when I finally got that promotion, when I finally was able to run that big race, when I finally got someone to prove to my ex I could get someone, we thought that question would go away, but it didn't. And so Paul, even after all the success that he had seen at this point in his ministry, he's still facing people who want to call him timid and unqualified. And so he writes them this. He says, you're judging by appearances. And that's a pretty good summary definition of this artificial confidence we're talking about, right? You're just looking and judging by the highlight reels. He says, if anyone is confident that they belong to Christ, they should consider again that we belong to Christ just as much as they do. It's like, I'm confident in my standing. Don't need to prove it. It's already been demonstrated. And so he elaborates. So, even if I boast somewhat freely about the authority the Lord gave us for building you up rather than tearing you down, I will not be ashamed of it. In other words, he's saying here, some might be accusing me of being a little bit out there, it's overstating my standing, but every bit of it is so you will know your standing as well. And not to make you feel small, not to make you feel inferior. So I'm not going to back down on that at all, he says. He says, I do not want to seem to be making you feel, next slide, please. I do not want to seem to be trying to frighten you with my letters, because apparently some people were accusing him of this as well. Paul's just trying to intimidate you. Don't get all worried about him, right? But then it kind of starts to feel personal. I think into the next verses. He says this. He says, for some say his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person, get this, he's unimpressive. His speaking amounts to nothing. I was like, ouch. For some of us, that might be valid when we think about, okay, am I really who I say I am in person and not? But Paul, okay, you write good, but yeah, okay, wait till you see him in person. Wait till put him in front of a crowd. No, he's not that great at all. He looks great online, but that's not the real Paul. I mean, I should be asking myself at times, am I really the person I portray myself to be? And this is where Paul could have showed up and just said, all right, you wait till I get down there. I'm going to show him, right? You know who I am? Do you know all that I've accomplished? I'm Paul, right? He could have just played up to their expectations. But instead, he doesn't go aggressive and retaliate on them, but he doesn't go passive and not say what needs to be said either. He strikes this perfect balance of assertiveness. He shows his authority, his confidence, without a need to flex and prove himself because it's already been demonstrated. Look at this. Man, I wish I could be this smooth. He says, such people should realize that what we are in our letters when we are absent, we will be in our actions when we are present. He's like, I don't have to prove any authority that's already been demonstrated. So I'm not going to give any weight to any of that chatter, right? We're the same people, absent or present. Same people in our letters as we are in person. I'm the same person online as I am offline. And that's why I can be confident, because I can show up and I don't have anything to prove. Already demonstrated it. He goes on, we do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves when they measure themselves by themselves and they compare themselves with themselves. That sound familiar? It says when they do that, they are not wise. And I kind of think he's biting his tongue a little bit here at the end. He's like, all that comparing and posturing and all that sizing each other up, that's just dumb because you're missing the point. For me, Paul's response teaches me that when I embrace my individuality and when I find fulfillment in the purposes of God and what he has for me, I worry much less about proving myself to everybody else and proving my worth. Comparison starts to lose its power. That's when confidence starts to flourish. Because true confidence is not rooted in all these external circumstances or self-seeking accolades. True confidence, it's found in embracing Christ-like humility. It's found in overcoming these comparisons and seeking the approval of God above anything else. I can remember several years back, I was sitting across the table from a gentleman who came to me with a printed out bullet point list of all the reasons that I was unfit and unqualified to lead and pastor. And most of it was nonsense, but some of it was valid, and all of it hurt. It cut me deeply, and I almost believed him. I almost packed it in. Now, as I look back on it as a much more wise and mature man now, what I should have said was, man, you don't know the half of it, right? Give me that list. I'll add a few things for it. There you go. I mean, now what? Because what I didn't know then, but I'm learning, is that there is a strength to be found in owning our limitations. Sometimes I'm not that impressive. Sometimes I feel inadequate. I drop the ball a lot, I am nowhere near where I want to be. But I'm also not where I used to be. I've demonstrated some growth. I've got my glitches, I got my cracks, but I also have a divinely created purpose. I've got weaknesses, but I've got strengths. And that puts me in some pretty good company of people that God has worked in and through. So, bro, I hope this list makes you feel better, but you can keep it. Just join the club, right? Here's what I didn't know then, but I'm learning now. Humility allows us to acknowledge our limitations and lean on God's strength, which in turn builds our confidence. Because Paul had some great gifts, right? But he still felt this pressure to defend his qualifications. And the way he does it is really interesting to me because he doesn't put up a front. When I read his words, in fact, I sense some hurt there. I can relate to that. Maybe you can too. Because even he starts to compare his speaking abilities to his writing abilities. Look at what he was hearing again. They said, for some say his letters are weighty, forceful in person. He's unimpressive. Speaking amounts to nothing. Paul, man, you write a lot better than you speak. Even after all the success, voices are still bothering him. And if Paul has those voices, you're going to have those voices too. I'm going to have those voices too. I mean, the truth is we don't even need other people to remind us of all the places we fall short, do we? Most of us have this chatterbox in our own heads that are constantly trying to convince us you're unqualified, you're unimpressive, you're unskilled, you're unworthy. And I think we know that Paul struggled with this because he kept writing about it even into the next chapter of this letter. Look at what he said. He said, I may indeed not be untrained as a speaker, right? I own that. But I do have knowledge. I know my strengths. And I don't think you say something like this unless you're wrestling with it a little bit. I think we tend to picture Paul showing up maybe at some of these churches he helped to plant as the guest missionary speaker, right? He's got this big, bold, authoritative voice, man. He's using great illustrations, big personality. The truth is, some people heard Paul speak and just kind of went, meh. Yeah, I expected a whole lot more from his letters. You know, a lot of them actually compared him to another really famous guy that was preaching at the time named Apollos. I say pretty famous. He was famous then, but we don't know much about him now, which actually kind of says a lot to this point. Apollos could preach, and it was divisive because some people would be like, hey, Paul can't preach like Apollos, so I'm going to follow Apollos. Because apparently Apollos, I mean, he even had a great name, right? Apollos. Apollos could be eloquent. Apollos could hold your attention for hours. He was an orator. He knew how to use the analogies and the metaphors. He's a human thesaurus, antonyms, synonyms, all the names, right? He could preach. And Paul says, listen, I know I'm not that great of a preacher. I'm no Apollos. And it kind of bothers me a little bit because he talks about confidence, but then he shines a spotlight on his own deficiencies. But I think it's pretty powerful too because Paul apparently was aware of his strengths and his weaknesses so much that he was able to write this in the same letter. He said that in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh. And we don't know what this is. It could have been something physical maybe. It could have been like a speech impediment. Could have just been the voices in his head and from outside that were playing with his insecurities. Whatever it was, he said 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. So he learned it because he said, therefore, I'll boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, about my glitches, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That's why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults and hardships, persecutions and difficulties. For when I'm weak, that's when I'm strong. It was Paul's glitch that became his gift. You getting this? Because think about this, okay? Consider this. If Paul who wrote all of these letters, who wrote so much more of what we have now in our New Testament, I just have to wonder, okay, if Paul would have been a better speaker, would we have even had these letters? Would he have ever even picked up a pen to write? I mean, if Paul could have preached like Apollos, would we even have these letters to the Corinthians? Would we have his letters to the Romans, to the Ephesians, to the Philippians? Would we have all these things still preserved for us today? Perhaps Paul picked up a pen because he couldn't preach like Apollos. And that hits me deep because it was his glitch that became his gift. The words that we're reading on the screen today, they might not even be here if Paul had been a better speaker. Think about it. It was because he couldn't preach like Apollos that he wrote like Paul. And now this isn't a crack on Apollos. Apollos probably did a lot of good for the gospel, did a lot of great things. He was probably a really great guy. But there is nothing that I can point you to about anything that he actually said. I don't know. There was a reputation. There are verses we read about Apollos, but nothing written by Apollos. But he was impressive. And I'm sure a lot of the things he said were really profound. But unfortunately, they were said, and then they were forgotten. Paul couldn't preach like Apollos, but he could say, I'll boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses. I'll take the insults from the outside. I'll deal with the lies from the inner bully on the inside. That's the me I want to show up on Instagram with, because when I'm weak, that's when I'm strong. That's real confidence. Not in spite of, but because of Paul's glitch, I get to stand up here and teach his words again to you today. And listen, okay, the hard truth is that your weakness, your glitch, might not go away. But that's okay. It's better than okay. Because true confidence is born out of humility and demonstration. And God can put it to work better than if you never even had it to begin with. And now that's not saying don't try to improve, right? Don't get the knowledge. Don't keep training. Don't keep trying to grow. Don't fix what needs fixing. Do all of that. But we all have to acknowledge our cracks. We need to acknowledge our scars, our weak spots. These things can help us be humble and be opportunities for real confidence. I think Paul would have cried for Princess Penelope too. Because before she was a princess, she's stuck in this video game, right? She can't race because of her glitch. But if you watch the movie, you remember the whole reason that she had the glitch to begin with is because they unplugged the game because they knew she was royalty. That was her identity, and all those jealous fakers knew it. I don't know, maybe that's your homework. You go home and watch Wreck-It Ralph again this week for the full spiritual impact of this, right? Because in the end, it was a glitch, got across the finish line. Remember, she saved the whole game. Spawned a sequel. It would be even better, though, than going back and watching a movie. Why don't you go back and read Paul's 2 letters to the Corinthians and look at what he says about real confidence. You could go back and even read his backstory. It's in the book of Acts, where he came to be a follower of Jesus and how this led up and built his confidence as well. Paul's gift, or glitch, became the gift. It's still transforming lives and hearts and minds today. Think about that. If you'll acknowledge your glitch, even embrace it. If you'll give it to God, acknowledge that your true identity is never going to be found in this artificial image of yourself you put out in the metaverse. It's not going to be found in the feedback you get there either. It's found in the purposes of your Creator. You can see your weaknesses become a conduit for confidence. And you can see your glitches become demonstrating opportunities for His strength in you. Your weakness can become a conduit of confidence. And I love how Paul highlighted this in the same letter. He said, as long as you're just looking at appearances, if you're just looking at me, you're going to miss the brightness. You're going to miss it, so don't miss it. He says, we carry this precious message around in the unadorned clay pot of our ordinary lives. There we are. Why? To keep anyone from confusing God's incomparable power with us. And I love it. Because do I have what it takes? No, depends on who I ask. Your perceived weakness, my perceived weakness, with God's strength and purpose, that's a conduit for true confidence. Father, I pray that today, that you would give us the strength we need for tomorrow. I thank you for giving us everything we need to do, everything that you ask of us today. Help us to lean into that. Teach us the truth of this, to be able to face our own critics, to face our own comparisons, even the compliments maybe that feed our pride. God, I just pray that you would help us to learn to live out of a true confidence in you. And through your grace and your strength, we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.